Southgate, what is going on?
Hi, my name's Summer O'Brien and I'm the Collections Engagement Manager and Head Archivist here at Eden Camp Modern History Museum. I had no idea about the bombardment of 1914 when I was a child, or how this would go on to shape my life.
You dropped 100 mines and it was a very, very effective minefield. Arguably, a lot of people said probably the most effective minefield of the First World War.
Whilst the population of the UK was just waking up, the navy of the German Empire was approaching England's north-east coast at speed. The towns of Scarborough, Whitby and the Hartlepool were about to get a wake-up call that they'd not forget for a very long time.
Now, what they saw was ships, large vessels, coming in at speed.
It was just 9 days before Christmas, Wednesday the 16th of December 1914.
The janitor or the caretaker, he was concerned about what was happening, so he took some of the younger kids that had come from further afield. He immediately took them into the basement. But thereafter, a shell crashed down on the school and completely obliterated the school hall.
The German Navy was about to unleash an attack that would shake up our quiet northeast towns to the core and enrage a nation. I always used to come and sit when it was a sunny day and just kind of get a bit of inspiration, but to see this now, it's really heartwarming in a way. I want to find an answer to why the Navy failed to prevent these attacks.
He's looking at this going, I need answers. Oi, Southgate, what is going on?
I will learn how the Hartlepool responded to the attack and make comparisons between the three towns.
So they had that information in the Admiralty. Winston Churchill was in charge of the Admiralty, and he had to decide what to do with that information, and he decided not to alert any of the ports on the East Coast that a raid was going to take place.
Finally, I want to tell you about how the government used Scarborough in their propaganda campaign for enlistment. You're probably wondering why someone like me, born more than 8 years after the raid on these towns, is interested in the bombardment of the First World War. My first visit to Eden Camp was when I was around 5 or 6 years old. My mum and dad always used to bring me every year. It was great, sometimes more than once in the summer holidays. I loved it. From the moment we'd pull up in the car, I'd be like a coiled spring, waiting to be released. Even in the early 2000s, I was totally consumed by my interest in history. As a child as well, when growing up studying history in primary school, it was quite more creative really, more than an academic perspective. Then it shifted to secondary school, and then the academic stuff started to hit, which was interesting as well, and that's where the society impact of things come towards me, and I thoroughly enjoyed studying that too. The impact on society interests me the most because it is day-to-day life that we all experience. We get up, we go to work or school and come home. Discovering how people lived in comparison to us in modern day life, and how one event can completely change and shape society. Now that's the part of history I really enjoy. Moving on to university, that's where my studies commenced. I thoroughly enjoyed learning all about modern history, and that's why I'm here at the museum today. I got to learn about the bombardment through just walking around Scarborough really. There wasn't much on it, and I thought, could I maybe write something about this? This actually led me to write both my theses for my undergraduate and my master's degree, and it was the society impact that really made this special. The first signs that Wednesday morning was going to be completely different from the norm was when the civilians heard loud crashes and bangs. The civilians were doing the normal daily routines of delivering milk and post when all of a sudden they saw these big shells fly over their head into buildings. The women were getting the children ready for school, and everyone was just generally going around their daily routine. I paid a visit to Scarborough Maritime Heritage Centre. What do you think the Germans were trying to target then?
Well, to be honest, it's not 100% clear. Nobody's quite worked that one out. Yeah. But they seem very keen on hitting the headlands with the castle.
Yeah.
And they are quite accurate, so they do manage to hit the so-called military barracks on the headland.
Yeah.
In fact, the barracks hadn't been occupied by troops since I think it's 1878.
Yeah.
So their information was slightly out of date, but they did demolish the whole of the barracks, which is an obvious target, and they also demolished the Coast Guard station on the headland as well. So that suggests that there was a serious attempt to knock out some military installations on the headland.
There were 2 battle cruisers involved, Von der Tann and Derflinger, and 1 mine layer called Kolberg. The bombardment of Scarborough began at approximately 8 a.m. The Germans fired 11-inch shells across the whole of Scarborough. Over 500 shells were fired in half an hour. First targets for the Germans in Scarborough was the wireless station, the castle and the Grand Hotel. Here I am opposite the Esplanade Hotel. This is a fantastic area to view the harbour, the Grand Hotel and the castle itself. On Wednesday the 16th of December 1914, the morning was very different to how it is today. It was grey, misty, foggy and cloudy. The captain of the steam trawler, St Cloud, couldn't see his way into the harbour. This was because the lighthouse itself hadn't been lit since the start of the First World War. The deckhand come to tell the captain there were some ships approaching. They didn't know what ships they were until the German flags were raised. Once they knew that these were German ships, he raised his anchor and made his way into the harbour. After all, the Germans were after much bigger targets, such as the Grand Hotel and the castle. There were a lot of shells fired at the castle, and this mainly landed at the old barracks. The building was nearly completely destroyed. Luckily, at the time, there was no one in there. The castle was a primary target, and I believe that this was premeditated, 100%. So, can you tell me how the people reacted once the bombardment started?
Well, there are sort of conflicting reports on that, but some of the stories that emerged from the bombardment suggest that there was a lot of community resilience and a bit of a sort of stiff upper lip on the part of the people of Scarborough. So one example would be the story of Sir George Sitwell, and where the shells started flying over his house and one of the shells hit his house. Sir George took all his household and his staff down into the cellar, but while the shells were crashing around, his wife stayed in bed and she insisted on finishing reading the morning papers. And obviously that story is very much about how the community sort of were able to sort of cope with the stress and the shock of the bombardment. And there is another story a bit similar to that at St Martin's Church, which is on Southcliffe. And it was hit by a shell during the bombardment in the middle of Holy Communion.
Yeah, I've heard about this.
And the Archdeacon was conducting Holy Communion. The church was hit, but he insisted they'd carry on to the end of the service because they were British.
I've brought you down to the lighthouse to show you where the lighthouse was struck. As you can see around me here, this is a great view of Scarborough, the castle behind me, etc. But this very lighthouse where we're stood was actually struck by a shell. The shell struck the side of the lighthouse, and then 3 days later, the whole top of it was demolished. So I heard about the Gladstone School being attacked, and what happened there?
Well, the school was Gladstone Road School. When the bombardment started, the janitor or the caretaker, he was concerned about what was happening, so he took some of the younger kids that had come from further afield. He immediately took them into the basement. But thereafter, a shell crashed down on the school and completely obliterated the school hall. And this was at exactly 8:35. We know it was exactly 8:35 because the school clock in the hall stopped at 8:35.
Interesting.
But the frightening thing about the story is people often note that if the shell had landed half an hour later, there would have been 100 to 150 pupils in the school hall. So they were very lucky they hadn't come to school at that time.
Definitely 100%. And I think as well, obviously, that element of worry and panic has set upon parents as well, kind of fitted into that as well, essentially. And what was the whole idea of them having an early Christmas? Is that true?
Well, the school didn't reopen till after Christmas, so there was a bit of bravado, I believe, among some of the school children, and they were sort of celebrating not having to go back to school. But I think a lot of the parents thought that it would be better if the kids were back at school, because it was a sort of place of reassurance, given they'd had a terrible shock and a trauma from the bombardment.
SMS Derflinger left Scarborough at 8:30 in the morning. They then began to bombard Whitby at 9 a.m. The people of Whitby weren't informed of what was happening. People believed that the war was going to be over before Christmas, and that wasn't the case. They were now being attacked on their homeland. Whitby, similar to Scarborough at the time, were suffering with absolute chaos. People were running to the train station and they didn't understand what was going on. While Scarborough and Whitby were under attack, so too was Hartlepool. I travelled from Whitby to Hartlepool to meet with Andy Abson, a museum volunteer and guide at Heugh Battery Museum. So in 1914, Hartlepool was referred as the Hartlepools. Why was this?
It's two separate entities. It's got an older part, which is Hartlepool, and that's what you're studying now. You're studying the old Hartlepool, and that recorded history is going back to early medieval time. So when we started to record properly, and it's predominantly a fishing port. However, once we get into the 1800s, we've got the railways expansions. The port itself is in a prime location. You've got direct access straight into the North Sea. You've got to remember, when you get into that period, especially the 1800s, it's a very, very entrepreneurial world. The Victorians are fantastic entrepreneurs. It's all about the money. People looked at that and they went, ooh, that's a good idea. We can get stuff in there. These railway things, we can shift stuff, and they were shifting coal to start off with. Everybody was shifting coal. The Hartlepool, the original Hartlepool, has its own unique identity. And there was no way on this planet they were letting it go. But as the town expanded, they were then municipally separated. Only by a street, but you had Hartlepool and West Hartlepool. And that's where the Hartlepools come from. And this existed up to 1967. At that point, municipal boundaries came together and it became one entity as Hartlepool. However, the people on the headland, as it was now referred to, because they have such a fierce identity that they wanted that separation to exist. Because even to this day, they have got a massively fierce identity of who they are. And we become part of that identity as the Battery, as the Heugh Battery Museum becomes part of that identity, because we're custodians of a big part of their history.
This is a really interesting development in the story of the bombardment for me. Unlike Scarborough and Whitby, that were undefended, there were gun batteries defending the Hartlepools. We walk a few hundred metres to Heugh Battery Museum, where I ask Andy about the history here. So I understand that the battery's been here from the 17th century, but what's happened since then?
Quite a lot, really. Initially, well, you can see, but just by looking out, it's a prominent place to defend what you're trying to defend inland.
Yeah.
So there has been something here, and that's recorded in earlier mapping and lithographs showing the depiction of a gun and mounds on the headland. We can even go up to the first edition OS. The first edition OS shows on the town moor behind you a set of earthworks, and just where the promenade is now, there's what we call a cup and saucer indicated, and potentially that's the remains of an actual gun position or battery position. It wasn't really until the 1850s that we started to get serious about defending this area. Lighthouse Battery came first, 1855, 1856. That was taken over, and they had to pay rent for it because it sat within the precinct of the Port Authority. Right. And they pay £1 a year rent for that area, and they built the battery. 4 years later, 1859, the Heugh Battery appeared. These were both multi-gun 68-pounder batteries. Quite common coastal battery. Obviously technology progresses, and we also had the downscaling. Originally they were 6-gun batteries. They were then downscaled, and they became more of a training aid really for other batteries and other areas that were classed as more of a danger. There was more of a danger to attack in certain areas. That went back in scale again to an actually defended battery that was taken seriously when we started to get into the world of breech loading guns. So the guns are the sort of things that you can see next to you.
Yeah, so I'm assuming obviously this wasn't the one that was there.
No, I'll come on to what was there, but it's that idea. It's now, instead of having to ram everything down the front end, the muzzle, we're now got the ability to seal the back so we can load it from the back and efficiently and within budget, because we had breech loading before then, but it was very, very hard and very expensive because we didn't have the ability and the money in some cases to do it on a big scale, whereas now we had. And we'd settled on a calibre at this point. So we'd settled on the 6-inch as a calibre. So that's basically the diameter of the bore of the gun, is 6 inches. And we stayed with that. And we stayed with that all the way through until coastal defence disappeared, really. It was always around. It was something that the Navy used a lot of, and 6-inch guns were everywhere. Early 1890s, we were using different ways of actually mounting the gun. We had a thing called a hydropneumatic mount, which basically raised itself up. You fired the gun, and then the recoil of the gun threw it back down, so it hid in its own emplacement. You reloaded it, it came back up again, you fired it, and it hid itself again. And that's what the lighthouse battery had. 1907 was the big change. That was when we went, right, yeah, they're great, but we need something that's a bit quicker.
Yeah.
And they permanently mounted in emplacements. The 6-inch, we're onto the Mark 7 by then, so 6-inch Mark 7, and it's sat on a Mark 2 central pivot mount. And there is a part of it left down there. The
Yeah.
only bit that's left of the ordnance for the guns that actually fired on the day is in number 1 emplacement, and it's a big, large metal ring with
Wow.
bolts sticking out of it. And that's the thing we call the holdfast, and that's there to hold the gun in place. The bolts themselves are 8 feet long, and they're embedded into the concrete. Because when you decide that I'm going to use this type of gun, you build the emplacement for that gun.
Yeah.
Other changes, not really that much. What you can see in the flat sense, i.e. this is number 1 gun, this is as it was from 1907.
Right.
And you can see how low it is. And the gun itself that was here, the 6-inch Mark 7, wouldn't have sat much higher than that.
I hadn't realised how batteries might have changed over the years, and with the approach of World War I, Andy described to me how the dynamic of the Yacht battery changed.
The Yacht battery was here, the lighthouse battery was there, Southgard, which was mentioned earlier on, which was mentioned, and then we've got down the coast, we've got Fairy Cove, which is literally just over there. It's on the bend. If you look past the battery, where the houses bend around, that's Fairy Cove. There was a gun there, that was removed, but that was where the commander of these fortresses, because they are fortresses,
Yeah.
he was at Fairy Cove. He decided, no, I can't control what I've got my assets from there. I'm going to move to the Yacht battery. What he did then was take over what we call the battery commander's post. Now, initially, the battery's commander's post is only a small piece of concrete. It looks like a concrete basin with a pillar in the middle of it. But he needed something a bit more substantial. So he put the plans in, and the plans are still in the National Archive of what he wanted as a battery command post. And that's what you can see across my left shoulder.
Wow.
Originally, the earth bank went right up to the windows.
Yeah.
So it was protected. But when you look at that and you think, well, if everything is low down here, that stands out like a sore
it's gonna,
thumb.
yeah.
And during the bombardment, they all thought, if anything's going to go, it's that.
It's gonna be that one, yeah.
But didn't even get touched.
That's really interesting.
The other thing that he did was go, right, we want to do this tricky, remember the fooling thing of the range?
Yeah.
Well, that's what that fence does behind you. Because that fence, it looks like we've got it out of a skip and nailed it to the wall. But it's there to break up and to change the actual skyline behind the battery.
So it's not just one standard.
So it's not one standard, and you can't
That's really
look at that
clever.
and go, you can see St Hilda's,
Yeah.
but everything else is a bit of a mishmash of, well, how far's that, how far's that?
That's really clever.
And it hides, and it basically hides in plain sight. And it did work. It did fool the German range takers into getting their ranges wrong.
I'm here at Whitby Abbey, close to where the Coast Guard station was, and it was hit by a high explosive shell. We believe that the first targets for the Germans coming to Whitby was the Coast Guard station, and then also the Abbey, which is behind us. Frederick Randall was one of the Coast Guards based here. Sadly, as he exited his house to observe the commotion, a shell burst close to one of the outbuildings, and Frederick was killed. His wife was in the house at the time. Frederick Randall was actually the only Coast Guard to be killed on land. Nearly 2,000 Coast Guards were killed at sea. Sadly, I can't show you the Coast Guard station today. That's not because it was destroyed in 1914, but in 2010 it was completely demolished because it was becoming extremely close to the cliff's edge. The damage to Whitby Abbey included the western front and the north stair. Now, it is debatable to whether the damage to the Abbey was caused by a direct hit or vibrations caused by a shell falling close by. It was later repaired in the 1920s, with each brick being individually labelled and returned to its place in the structure. There were a few properties close by to the Abbey that were damaged. This includes St Mary's Church. The building itself wasn't actually damaged, but the glass all the way round was completely smashed. From here on Church Street, you can see across the River Esk onto the station. Across from that is Spring Hill Terrace and Fishburn Park. The great majority of the shots had passed over the East Cliff and fell half a mile further on in the region of the railway station, where nearly all of the material damage was done. Here, in the Fishburn Park district, houses were wrecked, and here was where the second fatality occurred. William H. Tunmore, a railwayman employed on the North Eastern Railway, was a victim. He was driving a horse and cart at the Bagdale crossing near the railway station when a small shell struck him and killed him on the spot, although the horse was absolutely uninjured. He was 61 years of age and a married man, his home being in Grey Street. The only other case was that of an invalid lady, Mrs. Miller, of Spring Hill Terrace, who was hit in the side by a piece of shell while she was laying in bed. It's incredible to compare Scarborough and Whitby, how inadequately prepared they were for a raid like this. Further north, the Hartlepoles were under attack. The British Navy never came to the aid of our Yorkshire resorts. But was that the same for the Hartlepoles? So what happened when the Germans approached the bay?
Well, to start off with, we need to go back a little bit. To defend this coast, you've got to have two things. One, you've got to have eyes, and you've got to have something to shoot. Well, we've got something to shoot in the guns, but you've got to have eyes. So what they did, the Navy, was push out what we call patrol flotillas. And these tended to be things like river-class destroyers, which were only small ships, armed with torpedoes and 12-pounder deck guns. It's their job to be the sniffer dog. They go out, they look, they see what's happening, and they report back. Because the war had started, and we know the German Navy is quite formidable, they'd bolstered this slightly with a couple of cruisers, in this case HMS Patrol and Forward. They were sat in the dock, and we also had a submarine, C9 was sat there as well. So this, what would be a normal patrol, was bolstered up. On the morning of the 16th of December though, the only ships that had gone out as they would regularly do on their patrol was the 4 river-class destroyers. So we had HMS Doon, Waveney, Moy and Tess. And they go out as a group and do their little sniffer dog up and down the coast, looking to see what's happening. The weather on that morning wasn't brilliant, and what we get is a sea threat. And anyone who lives on the coast, especially on the east coast of Britain, will know what a sea threat is. It ends up as like a rolling bank of fog that moves backwards and forwards. So things can come out of it, they can disappear back into it again. That was sitting at about 6,000 yards at this point in the morning. So they were out. If you look over, I'll just give you an idea of distance. If you look over my left shoulder, out there we can see a bank of modern wind turbines. The left-hand bank is approximately 2 nautical miles away. And that works out to about 5,000 yards. So that's sort of to give you an idea of the distance that we're sort of talking about that you could see. The other thing as well, if you look out into the bay at the minute, we've got lots of pleasure craft out there, lots of sailing boats. The scene wouldn't have been too much different because of the fishing. This was a fishing port, predominantly a fishing port, especially the headland, the old part of Hartlepool. So they'd have been out doing their things, and they actually are an intricate part of the story as well. Everything's nice and happy until the battery at South Gar, because the other parts of this, obviously the Lighthouse Battery, the Youth Battery, we also had a battery at South Gar. Now South Gar is literally the spit of land that sticks out on the south bank of the Tees. 4.7-inch guns, so not the range of the guns that were here. They saw what was going on. Now what they saw was ships, large vessels, coming in at speed. What happened then was the patrol obviously saw them. The patrol knew what they were straight away, but South Guard didn't. So straight away there's a bit of a misinformation of what was actually going on. The only people who knew really what was going on at this point was the 4 destroyers. They then did what the Royal Navy does. They went, come on then fellas, let's have a crack. 4 little river-class destroyers coming up against 3 heavy cruisers. 2 heavy cruisers and an armoured cruiser. Not a good odds. But they had a go. Give them the due, they had a go. They engaged at about 4,000 yards. All the time this is going on, South Guard's watching them going, what is going on here? The bit of confusion does come from the fact that when the Germans engaged them, as they were trying to get in, the river-class destroyers were trying to get into engagement range with their 12-pounder deck guns, but mainly with a torpedo. The German barrels were out to sea, so they were firing out to sea. So South Guard's looking at it going, right, I can see an ensign, but Is it British or is it German? Because if you sit them both together, the British battle ensign and the German battle ensign, at a distance in bad weather, they look exactly the same. So you can be excused for maybe getting that wrong. The other people who knew exactly what was going on, as I mentioned, fishing boats. The fishing boats were out there at the same range. They could see exactly what was going on. If you have, because there is a story that, and it comes from the fishing boats, that they were flying a Royal Navy ensign. Now, this sounds like, oh, that's totally illegal, but it's not actually. It was quite a common practice. The British did it as well. The problem you've got is if you fire with the wrong ensign up. So what you have to do is drop that ensign, put yours up, and then fire. So they started engaging the destroyers. The Germans weren't intending for that to happen. They were coming here to carry out their raid. They had a program to their raid, because remember, this is just a little part of a massive strategic operation. So they had a plan that they were going to come here, no more than an hour, engage and go. So they got a little bit of a, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Wasn't really an issue. They engaged them. They won't have used their main armament. It'll all have been engagement with 6 and 8 inch guns, their secondary armaments. They caused a lot of damage, especially to the Doom, because the Doom led the charge. He was really the flotilla commander. He led the charge. They got mullered, basically. There was only one, the Moy, who really didn't get any damage. The rest were too heavily damaged. They couldn't do anything. There is part of the story that says they did engage with torpedoes, but it's a bit woolly in the information. Even in the Admiralty information, it doesn't really clearly say that they engaged. If they did do that, they would have had to have been within 4,000 yards. All this is being observed as best possible from both the Heugh Battery and from South Gar and from the Lighthouse Battery. They're all looking at it. Now, as we know, they're already in action, what we call in action. They're ready to engage. They just don't know what to engage at the minute. Are these British? Are they German? And that conversation goes on. They're aimed at them, they're sat laid at them, what we call laid, so they're following. So they will lay the gun at the ship that they've been told to lay at, and they will follow it. That was happening, but everything's going out to sea. All the engagement is out at sea, so they're like, what is going on? And Colonel Robson, who was the fortress commander, and was actually the commander of this section of the defence, he's looking at this going, I need answers. Oi, South Gar, what is going on? Who are these people? He has a good idea of who they are, but he needs definite confirmation. As they come out, remember this fog is moving about, not very fast, but it is moving. As they come out of it, the destroyers have turned and run, basically, because they don't want to get destroyed, because they will. They can't fight these type of ships. They come in, the barrels swing inwards, inland, and he then realises who they are, and the engagement starts.
What Andy talks about here is really interesting to me. The scope of both my theses never touched on the German Navy's intentions, or, indeed, if this was part of a bigger plan. Whilst this and the attack on Scarborough was happening, another German ship, SS Kolberg, was busy too. I went to meet Dr. David Pendleton at Scarborough Sub Aqua Club to learn more. So David, what have you actually been documenting?
Well, believe it or not, nobody knew exactly how many ships had been sunk in the minefield. So the first job was to work out how many ships had been sunk, and we think it's 20. And I say think because we are hunting for 5 wrecks. Even now, 15 we've got identified, and then there's 137 sailors are killed on the wrecks themselves.
So were the mines laid whilst the raid on Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby were going on?
Absolutely. So when the 2 battle cruisers were attacking Scarborough, the SMS Kolberg, which is a German light cruiser, she peels off. So the Kolberg started laying her mines off Caton Bay. She's only 300 metres from the cliffs, as that's like 3 football fields, isn't it? It's not far at all. She goes down to Grisfort Bay and then cuts out to sea.
How far out did these mines extend to?
Actually, not that far. On this map here, this is maps of all shipwrecks around the Scarborough area. You can actually see the line of shipwrecks, which follows exactly the course of the Kolberg. She's only a mile or 2 out, and the Kolberg went south towards Grisfort Bay, just north of Filey, and then she turned out to sea and continued to lay 100 mines until she got to the edge of the British minefield about a mile or 2 out.
What was the primary strategic purpose of these mines?
2 parts. Firstly, is to stop any Royal Navy forces coming up from Harwich and Hull to interfere with the bombardment, but mainly it's all about interdicting the trade, and mostly northeastern coal coming from the northeastern coalfields in Newcastle, going towards places like London, because coal was so important to the economy at that time, and across to France as well, because Paris had lost all its coal. The German invasion had cut off the French coalfields, so Paris, believe it or not, was almost entirely reliant on coal from the northeast.
What kind of mines did the Germans lay?
Well, these are sea mines. Everybody's in the mind's eye, they've got this idea of a spiky mine, haven't they? But what they've got is a weight. They were on a trolley and a weight, so they were pushed off the back of the ship. That weight would drop to the bottom of the sea, and then a predetermined length, depending on the depth of the sea at the point they were laid at, would come up, and it would hold the sea mine just below the surface. They were not visible to the ships. The ships wouldn't see them. That's the whole idea, and the ships would come along and then hit them. So that they were basically laid depending on the depth of the sea, and then as the tide changes, the minefield actually becomes more dangerous for shipping.
So what would have been the first indication to the local population that a vessel had actually been sunk?
Well, even to thinking about the people on the vessel itself, they wouldn't know the minefield's there. The first thing they know is when the ship hits the mine. The Elter water is the first ship that hits a mine, and she'd hit it late at night, but it would be you'd definitely hear it in Scarborough. But these lines they're quite close in. You know, you're talking 1 to 2 miles, so you would hear the detonations in Scarborough, definitely. And it was a very, very effective minefield. Arguably, a lot of people said probably the most effective minefield of the First World War.
It is really interesting talking to David about the mines laid by the Kolberg. He suggests as many as 20 vessels could have been lost to the mines. However, only 15 wrecks have been located and identified so far. David is confident that 137 lives were lost as a result of these mines. So David, who was responsible for recovering the bodies of these sunken vessels, and how did they do it?
Well, it might surprise you to know that nobody was actually. Most of the sailors went down with the ships. There was only 5 bodies recovered. 2 of those were brought into Scarborough injured and unfortunately died on land. And from all over the world, it's a surprisingly diverse story.
Over what period of time did we continue to lose these boats to these mines?
Well, the first ship hits the mine on the same day of the bombardment, which is December 1914, and the last ship is lost in March 1915.
Whilst I've suggested that Scarborough and Whitby were undefended towns, it is interesting to note that there was a military presence here. Stuart was able to tell me a bit more.
There was military barracks on Burneston Road called the Burneston Barracks, and there was genuinely troops in these barracks, and they didn't seem interested in them either, which is strange. And then most interestingly, and maybe controversially, there was a sort of naval wireless listening station on Sandybed Lane, and the jury's sort of out on that one, whether they were keen to hit the listening station or not. Some shells did fall fall short before the listening station. Some are in the general vicinity, but they don't get particularly close to the listening station. And the listening station obviously was very important because the listening station was a naval listening station, and it was listening into German wireless communication in the North Sea.
Yeah.
And then the information actually they were getting in the listening station was being sent down to the Admiralty in London to the famous Room 40. And in Room 40, they'd worked out how to break the German codes.
Yeah.
So it was a very key component in the maritime war in the North Sea.
Yeah.
It should have been a target, but I get the impression it probably wasn't. But some historians think it was, some think it wasn't. But they were very fortunate that it did survive, and it again continued to give information to the Admiralty about German movements. And it is the case that in this Room 40 in the Admiralty, they did know 2 days beforehand that an attack or a raid on the east coast of England was going to take place.
Yeah.
But you knew what was going on.
Yeah.
We knew something was going on. We didn't know exactly what. And for that morning, everything from Fort Paul on the Humber all the way up to Blythe, the other side of Newcastle, they were all stood to ready.
And this is the
because
whole
we
thing,
didn't know what was going. We knew something was going to happen.
It was going to be premeditated.
Yeah, something was
100%.
going to happen. We knew that. You've then got the argument, and has been made of, well, why didn't we tell people? It all links into intelligence. If we start going around moving people, they will know, and they will think, oh, hang on a minute, what's our first procedure? Change the codes.
Yeah.
They change the codes, we lose that information that we've gathered from capturing those code books and from help from the Russians. We lose that information. And you've got to look at this from Churchill's perspective as well. He was first Lord of the Admiralty. As part of this was his responsibility. He made that decision to a certain degree of what they do with this. And I think personally that he took that with him into the Second World War.
Yeah.
Because he had to make the conscious decision of using Ultra to protect the convoys or to keep it as a massive source of information. And he took that decision of, no, if convoys die, they die. We need to protect the information.
Yeah. Ultra, during the Second World War, was the method of breaking high-level encrypted code, for which Bletchley Park became famous with the German Enigma machine.
And I think he learnt a lot from this because he had to do exactly the same thing. And he even says that in some of his memoirs afterwards, that he had to make a conscious decision to let East Coast towns being attacked to save that information.
There was a lot of main targets for the Germans when the raid was conducted on Scarborough, so such as the castle and the Grand Hotel, things like that. What were the main targets for Hartlepool?
What they wanted was to stop the industry. They were targeting the industry. So you've got coal coming in and out, mainly out, but not so much by this point. Hartlepool was beginning to specialise. Believe it or not, there was a specialty in transporting eggs, into importing eggs. One of the main ones, though, was timber. We had big timber ponds at the back near the Slack, which is the old river that ran into the original harbour. A lot of that timber was coming in and it was getting shorn down and going straight into the pits. If you hit that and stop, it sounds innocuous, but if you stop timber and you stop timber going to the pits, you stop coal production.
Yeah.
You stop coal production, you affect the war effort.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just that. Down the coast, where they're just down past Ferry Cove, you've got the old cemetery. There used to be a battery there as well, but we dismantled that in 1907. That was dismantled and was empty. The Germans actually engaged that, we believe, as well. As part of their report, they said they engaged and silenced the cemetery battery, and that there was nothing there.
Wow.
But we can pretty much say that they did, because what they were after at the back of there was cement works and the wire rope factory. The docks themselves, the shipbuilding, they were all part of a legitimate target in a way. There is no place on this planet that was an industrial town that did not have its workers living next to its industry. You are going to hit what is sat around that target, and what's sat around that target is the people who work there.
In Scarborough, 18 people died, 17 on the day of the bombardment, and a further one of their injuries. In Whitby, 3 people died. So why were there more people killed in the Hartlepools?
The official total of the day, if you include some of the outliers that were, did they or didn't they, we're looking at between 118 and 120, and that's civilian and military. If we then look at casualties that are part of the bombardment, so people that were dying of wounds, amputations, anything that was connected to the bombardment, we can actually get that total up to, we're again with outliers, possibly 127 to 130 people.
Wow, so a lot more than Scarborough.
Yeah, but you've got to remember as well that the engagement here was roughly about the same time, maybe a bit longer. It would have been longer. And the targets here, like we were saying before, the targets here are different. This is an industrial town. They're hitting industrial targets. And you are going to cause a lot more damage within the population that sits around it. So you can expect it. And they're going to be fierce in the way they fight as well. You've got to remember again that the German Navy were targeting the specific targets in Scarborough.
Yeah.
But there was no fear of engagement from anything else. When they came here, they got a bit of a surprise by the Royal Navy, but they then had to deal with the batteries. The batteries were always going to shoot back. They had to deal with them. And to deal with it, it takes ammunition. You are going to chuck ammunition at it until you either suppress it or silence it. And if you don't get that right, as we mentioned before, it misses and goes winging into whatever's behind it. In this case, civilian houses.
So the deaths caused by the bombardment in the Hartlepools totaled to around 127. If we add Whitby's 3 and Scarborough's 18, that's a total of 148 killed that morning in less than 40 minutes. The country was in shock and the media were asking questions, but as we've learnt, the government and the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, were not in the position to give away their ace card. The fact that our intelligence service was cracking the German codes had to remain a secret at all costs, So what should the government do? How do they turn the sour mood of the public? So obviously Scarborough is known as a holiday destination. After the bombardment, did it put people off at all?
Well, I think there's two sides to that story. I think in the very short term, we did actually have quite a few sightseers travelling to Scarborough. It's what we call nowadays, I think, disaster tourism. But they came to see, you know, the devastation and the bombed out properties and such like, and they came to pick up sort of souvenirs.
Yeah.
And local people being quite sort of entrepreneurial, they would get sort of pieces of shells and such like and sell them to the tourists. And then it didn't take long before the town was producing commemorative bombardment medals and things like that. So there was sort of an opportunity to commercialise the bombardment in some ways. But that was at the beginning. But I think in the long term, the bombardment was very bad for Scarborough's tourist industry, because A, it was considered dangerous, because who knew if the German Navy was going to come back. But secondly, it wasn't the glamorous resort that it had been before the bombardment, because it was scarred by all sorts of ruined buildings and bombed out properties and such like. Yeah. So it was pretty ugly, and it took a long time for them to patch up the devastation from the bombardment.
A lot of damage was sustained in Scarborough. Many houses were shelled. During my research, I came across a family called the Bennetts. This family lived in the propaganda house at number 2 Wycombe Street. This very house was shelled, completely obliterated. Joanna Bennett, aged 58, sadly passed away on the 16th of December. She was nursing a child at the time. It was utterly horrific. Her hand was blown off and they dragged her into the courtyard where sadly she passed away.
I think to a large extent they were hitting Scarborough and Whitby and Hartlepool because they could, and they thought it would be good for the morale of the German Navy.
100%.
But they also thought it would be damaging to Britain's morale.
Which we know it was.
The German morale was lifted by the success of their raid and the fact that the ships got back through the fog and the British never managed to find them. But on the other hand, the British, I mean, there was a lot of anger about the Royal Navy at first.
100%.
So the raid was quite damaging in the very short term to British feelings about the war. But the British government was quite shrewd in taking control over the information about the raid.
And so the propaganda machine of the British government stepped up a gear as they started to swing the raid and the public outrage to their advantage.
What the British government did was it insisted, first of all, that all telephones were not allowed to be used after the raid, so that people couldn't phone and tell people what had happened.
What was going on.
And also telegrams were censored and the newspapers were censored so that they couldn't write anything about the raid. And therefore what the British government was able to do was to manage the news and then to develop a narrative that it was basically these sort of inhumane German brutes had tried to attack Scarborough, but the people of Scarborough had been plucky and brave and heroic. Winston Churchill sent a letter to Scarborough, as you may well know, and it was very anti-German, obviously, and he was writing to Scarborough on behalf of the Royal Navy, and he described the Germans as baby killers. In actual fact, there was only one baby, one 14-month-old baby, but Churchill used the plural as if they'd been massacring many babies.
This is where I find it interesting, because obviously the whole aspect of the baby killers, him writing to the mayor saying the baby killers of Scarborough, Hartlepool or Whitby wasn't, mentioned within that. And again, obviously because Scarborough was an undefended town, they used this to, his ability to be able to exploit that. But it's really sad that Hartlepool weren't recognised for that.
When it comes to recognition that we understand in the propaganda sense and the recruiting sense, you can look at Hartlepool disappeared. But it worked in the sense of galvanising a town within a nation. Because Hartlepool was, per head of population, outstripped most cities in producing money for the war effort because of what happened here. People flocked to join up because of what happened here.
The enlistment campaign had not been going so well nationally. This was about to change as a result of the German raid.
Once they'd established that the people of Scarborough and the other ports that were attacked had behaved very bravely, then they used that, as you said, for a recruitment campaign to get more people volunteering into Kitchener's armies before Christmas. And then they used the slogan very commonly, "Remember Scarborough." They used that much more commonly than, sadly, Hartlepool or Whitby. But I think the British government realised that, you know, Scarborough was a more famous place, it was better known, more people
This is what
had
I
visited
found out,
Scarborough. Yeah.
Obviously, because it was a holiday destination.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think in a way, obviously, the Germans used that to exploit that as well. It's like, we've attacked this big
Yeah.
holiday destination, look at us.
Yeah.
And obviously, Britain flipped it around and went, they've attacked a really
Yeah.
famous holiday destination.
Yeah.
You need to enlist Remember Scarborough. And I think that's really poignant, to be honest.
But in the northeast, it was never forgotten, and it's never been forgotten now.
No. I mean, it's an amazing memorial, and it's nice to see, you know, people obviously come and place things, and like they do at Scarborough as well. And every year I go and put a cross on the Bennett family's grave. You know, obviously that's my connection to them, but it's, you know, you didn't deserve this.
We do it every 16th of December.
Amazing.
We fire our 25-pounder. We salute, so we fire a salute. We have a parade here, and the population, it tends to be we get the youngsters, so you've got cadets and sea cadets, and they put crosses down this path to commemorate, and we read out all the names.
That's amazing. It's a really nice, you know, sentiment to them, and make sure that, you know, the history is remembered.
So we can sort of say, if you look at Aftermath, it hasn't really ended in a way.
Still going on.
Because we tend to, and a lot of that, you've got to take your hats off, and a bit of a plug here, you've got to take your hat off to our manager, Diana, who keeps this going.
Yeah, definitely. You can see, you know, so everyone's so passionate about the history here, and that's really, really important. My final visit on this journey for me was back to a familiar place, Dean and Manor Road Cemetery in Scarborough, where I met with Liz, who helps tend to the site. Hi Liz.
Hello.
Nice to meet you. You
And
okay?
you? Fine, thank you.
So I've heard you've got quite a lot to show me today.
We have. We've
Oh,
a lot of
fantastic.
cemetery and a lot
Yeah.
of graves. But
Fantastic. I'm here. I really want to see the Bennett grave again.
Yes.
That was very prominent with my work, so I'm quite excited to see that. So
right, we'll go and find the Bennetts then.
fantastic. So Liz, how many people are actually buried here?
17 of the 18 bombardment victims are in here. They all have one of the little black plaques that the friends arranged. And the lady who isn't buried here, Margaret Briggs, her brother took her home to Barnsley, but we've sent one of the little plaques through to Barnsley.
Oh, lovely.
So that's been placed on her grave as well. So they've all got a little one.
That's
little black
lovely.
plaque. Over there, if you'd like to
Fantastic.
come over.
Oh. Obviously, last time I was here, this wasn't here. So the fact that I get to see this today is really special.
Yeah,
Really, really special.
there we are.
Oh,
Albert has his stone.
finally. It was the Bennett family and their story and how it impacted society due to the bombardment which moved me to write both my theses. The Bennett family were just an ordinary family, living in Scarborough, pretty much like mine. It is why I've been able to make this journey of further discovery, to share some of the story with you. Spent many hours sat here writing my dissertations, both of them actually. I always used to come and sit when it was a sunny day and just kind of get a bit of inspiration, but to see this now, it's really heartwarming in a way. Oh, this makes me really emotional. You know, after all these years studying and feeling part of their lives,
Yeah.
you know, you learn so much about these people, and to be able to, you know, tell their story even today, it's just an absolute honour, and I'll be forever grateful for this moment. There is still so much more to unearth and share. Largely, this still remains an untold story.